This week, the January 6th committee finally released its full 845-page report and a trove of interviews transcripts from key witnesses. Lawmakers revealed that the committee is sending 4 criminal referrals for former President Trump to the Justice Department for inciting an insurrection, conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to make a false statement, and obstruction of an official proceeding. The committee also referred to the House Ethics Committee for Trump-allied Republican lawmakers, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and Representatives Andy Biggs, Jim Jordan, and Scott Perry for, quote, failure to comply with subpoenas. Here's January 6th committee member Jamie Raskin, a Democrat from Maryland, explaining the actions.
We understand the gravity of each and every referral we are making today, but we have gone where the facts and the law lead us, and inescapably, they lead us here.
The report also says one man, Donald Trump, is to blame for the Capitol attack and that Trump should be barred from ever holding elected office again. In a statement, Trump lashed out at the committee and accused lawmakers of carrying out a, quote, witch hunt against him. Joining me to discuss this historic week, Scott MacFarlane, congressional correspondent for CBS News, Ryan Riley, justice reporter for NBC News, and joining me around the table, Sungmin Kim, White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Mario Parker. He is the national politics editor at Bloomberg News. So thank you all for being here. Scott, let's dive into this week and into this report. What's your biggest takeaway when you look at the report, you look at all the names, including not just former President Trump, but so many others that lawmakers say were part of a plot that led up to January 6th?
Near the back of the report, I keep staring at one of the recommendations from this panel. After all 18 months of their investigation, the 10 public hearings, the 1,000 plus interviews, the 1 million plus records, and one of their recommendations is Congress should move to use the protections of the 14th Amendment to prevent Donald Trump from running for high office again because of his ties to an insurrection. No matter one's view on January 6th or the investigations that came from it, or all the work that's been done, we are quite clearly in history book area when a congressional panel is asking for Congress to utilize the 14th Amendment against a former president. There was so much in there that felt like the written word version of the public hearings, kind of the codified record of what we saw. But it's hard to escape two things. First of all, that the compelling nature of a synchronized, choreographed congressional hearing, the likes of which we've never seen before, with tens of millions of viewers, is likely more potent than a very long Christmas week report issued by this panel. I mean, I'll tell you one thing, though, Yamiche. They were given a mandate to work until January 2nd, 2023. They really squeezed every drop out of that time frame, didn't they?
They absolutely did. I mean, we are 2 days before Christmas, and we have to talk about this. But Scott, you talked about something, which is that this committee, it talked about barring former President Trump from holding office. So I want to come back to you, Scott, and just ask, how realistic is that? Do we think that Congress will ever get to that point, especially as we enter a new phase of divided government?
The 118th Congress, the one that comes up January 3rd, I have a better chance of winning the lottery and the NBA MVP award than that happening. A Republican-controlled U.S. House has promised it is dissolving this January 6th committee. It's going to investigate security failures from that day, and they're going to investigate the operations of the January 6th committee itself. There are any number of Trump loyalists who composed this House Republican conference. This investigation is over from the congressional side next week.
And Ryan, even as this investigation is over, they're hoping this ends up on your beat. They're hoping that the Department of Justice takes action here. But these criminal referrals, they hold no legal weight. So explain, if at all, how this might influence the Department of Justice, or could this all end up being symbolic?
You know, in some ways, potentially, as a lot of former federal prosecutors have said, this could potentially backfire because the Justice Department doesn't like to look like it's being led around by the nose by the committee. And I think that the committee turned over a lot of really valuable information and got information that I think that federal prosecutors would have had a really tough time bringing up because there wouldn't have been necessarily a criminal element that they would be able to investigate. You can't have criminal investigators in the Justice Department essentially just going around and figuring out what Donald Trump was doing on these certain times and getting into a lot of these details where there's no obvious crime that a federal grand jury, for example, would be able to look into. So they did really bring up a lot of really interesting information. I've been diving over, of course, all of those transcripts along with everyone else, and I think that they did bring a lot of information to the forefront. I think Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony, especially, and that dramatic television moment was really something that this committee will be remembered for in the long run. But remember, the Justice Department, in addition to that ongoing investigation into Trump, is really still only in the first half of this investigation in terms of just the number of defendants who went inside the Capitol. There are about 900 people who have been charged thus far, but that's only a fraction of the total number of people who a lot of online sleuths have told me and identified have either gone inside the building or who attacked law enforcement officers outside. The total number you're looking at there is around 3,000. So they have a really long road ahead. And another big news thing that came out of the Congress this week on the January 6th beat was that the Justice Department's getting a lot of money for those investigations. That came through the omnibus bill and will ultimately keep this investigation going forward until that statute of limitations potentially expires 5 years out, unless we see some massive change in the presidential administration.
All important things to think about as we go forward. Sungmin, I wanted to talk to you about the legacy of this committee. Never before in history has a committee referred a former president for a criminal prosecution to the Justice Department, even if there's no legal weight to it. I wonder what you make of the political implications here.
Well, I think what the January 6th committee was trying to do beyond their recommendations, beyond the criminal referrals, was to really create this document, this historical record to really recount and really make their point about what exactly was responsible for January 6th. Scott talked about how Republicans wanted to investigate security failures next year. The January 6th committee did look into that, and they emphasized that while there were failures, the fault lies with one man that day, and that's Donald Trump, from his inactions, his stoking of these election conspiracies, these election lies heading up to the riot on that day. So I think that was really the mission of the committee, and I also do think just the how they were able to convey this information will be a lasting legacy for them. I think it was really, you talk about a dense 800-page report versus these powerful, compelling hearings. I think what made some of the testimony so compelling for even Republicans is, and in particular Republicans in the Senate, other Republicans on Capitol Hill, is that these were words coming from some people who were among Trump's closest allies. We saw new footage this week of Hope Hicks, one of Trump's closest aides in the White House, talking about that day. We saw footage from Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, all of these close senior White House aides talking about what he did or did not do on that day and leading up to that day. And that was very powerful, and I think that was a really compelling recollection for the public writ large.
That was, as you said, that was really all compelling. I also wonder what you make of these ethics committee referrals. Is there anything that's going to come from that when you think of the fact that this committee is taking this action right before January 3rd, when the Republicans are going to take control?
Well, the House ethics committees on Capitol Hill are evenly divided to kind of avoid that partisan shift when control shifts from one party to another. But at the same time, I think what's going to come up in the argument, in sort of the political discourse, is that Republicans, when they take charge of the House in a matter of days, they are going to be pushing a lot of oversight, a lot of investigations on the Biden administration. And I think Democrats, I wouldn't be surprised if they point to perhaps their lack of compliance that has referred them over to the Ethics Committee as kind of a hypocrisy point here.
And Mario, it's really interesting when you think about sort of what happens next. You have former Vice President Mike Pence, who we saw running through the Capitol saying that he hopes the DOJ doesn't charge Trump. Then you have Senator Mitch McConnell telling NBC News that he thinks that Trump's role in the party has been diminished. What are you hearing from Republicans? What are Republicans saying about all of the things that we're just talking about?
Yeah, I think over the last month, 6 weeks or so, we've seen a culmination of just this, what we're going to see over the next year, which is a warring within the Republican Party, a fight for the soul of the Republican Party as well. So you saw the shot that Mitch McConnell took at former President Donald Trump this week, saying he's politically weakened. Mike Pence, who just finished up a book tour based off the calendar that typically means campaigns, that he may have presidential aspirations. There's no road still to the White House without that, at least for the Republican nomination, without that 30% or so of the GOP base that is still kind of rock solid for former President Donald Trump. So right now we're going to see, at least for the next, the calendar by mid-2023 will be looking at 2024 presidential election, and Republicans have a lot of soul searching to do, particularly after that disappointing midterm performance.
And Scott, what Mario is talking about is the fact that there is this sort of fight going on within the Republican Party. You have Mitch McConnell saying, no, we're not going to have just Trump-backed candidates be the candidates that we go with again. But you also have more than 150 incoming or people who will be in Congress next term saying that they have denied or questioned the 2020 election results. So you have a lot of people who agree, or at least say out loud that they agree with President Trump. So I wonder where this leaves the Republican Party when you think about sort of the fight that's going on here.
Yeah, more than 100 so-called election deniers won seats in the U.S. House 11 days from now. They're in the majority. They control the committees. They control the legislative agenda. They control the purse strings of the U.S. government. So they're going to have quite a footprint. What's more, over the next 11 days, Kevin McCarthy is having leverage exacted on him by that group as he seeks to be Speaker of the House. They are not going to be irrelevant here in Washington. So the Trump ardent supporters in the U.S. House have a political forcefulness about them, which we're going to see, especially as this new Congress begins.
And Ryan, as this new Congress begins, I want to, in some ways, go back to the transcripts that we're seeing. You think about the fact that Cassidy Hutchinson, someone whose name has been mentioned here. There are some who say, when you look at what she's saying, which is that her lawyer was telling her not to say things, or at least to say that she doesn't recall things when she believes that she recalls them. What does that tell you about sort of all the other people we saw in these transcripts say, I do not recall?
I mean, boy, first of all, I have to say, boy, was that cinematic. That if you read through that transcript, there's this moment where she's having this sort of crisis of conscience. She's driving back to her parents' place in New Jersey, and irresponsibly, I'd say, probably starts looking at Wikipedia while she's driving, and comes upon a Watergate entry. Ends up ordering the book. Gets delivered to her parents' house. She goes through this book over the weekend about, a Watergate whistleblower and what he did. It was written alongside Bob Woodward, and then ultimately decides to make this pivot and make this decision. And it is really damning for the Trump team, because, there's this obvious effort, it seems, that she says, to put forward, essentially cover up for the president. And I think that there's a lot of supporting evidence of that. And she can point to all of this, other evidence of her phone calls that she made, and, the Uber that she ordered when she was leaving, that can really support, I think, the underlying contention there, which is that this Trump world lawyer was trying to basically squash any of this public testimony and essentially stop the January 6th committee from getting the information that it was seeking. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes today in terms of going forward with that potential investigation into trying to stop the January 6th committee from getting information that they were seeking.
And Ryan, you touched a bit on it, but I want to ask you specifically, you had a new story out recently this week. It says Intel community escapes major criticism by January 6th committee for missing foreseeable Capitol violence. Break down your story in your latest reporting.
Yeah, I think while the January 6th committee did this great presentation on television, one of the real failures, I think, of this committee was evaluating these real serious intelligence failures in the lead up to January 6th. After September 11th, we had these evaluations and talking about the silos that we saw and all of the missed warning signs that were there. And a lot of this was just happening online and in broad view. And there were a lot of stories written by journalists. There were just a ton of red flags that were going up ahead of January 6th about how this could get violent. And I don't think we really have a firm answer exactly about what went wrong there. We've gotten bits and pieces of it here, including reporting in the Washington Post, reporting I've done myself, reporting that other people have done, but we haven't really gotten this really thorough look at what exactly went wrong. And especially at a time when you're about to give an extra $500 million to the FBI annually, you would think that Congress would really want to look and say, okay, how can we make sure that something like this doesn't happen in the first place? And instead, I think the committee tries sort of awkwardly in a lot of basis to pivot back to Donald Trump, even when there are obvious intelligence failures. And two things can be true at the same time. These things aren't mutually exclusive. You can contend that Donald Trump did these things that were wrong and this was a horrible situation. You can also say that there's a lot of evidence out there that should have made sure that the FBI and Capitol Police, DHS were more prepared for violence on January 6th.
Yeah. The other thing that I think when you look at this report and look at sort of all of the recommendations that they're making, Scott, the Electoral Count Act, it's being reformed now by Congress because of the omnibus bill. Do you think that that's the biggest legislative action that we're going to see? Could we possibly see anything else come out?
It's one of the things that had bipartisan support almost from the jump, although I'll note the Senate prevailed in the battle between the House and Senate on this. The baseline change that I think is most fundamental is that on January 6, 2021, you needed only one member of the House and one member of the Senate to object to stop the certification process and force a debate. In this new legislation, which was passed by the Congress this week, it's got to be 20% of the House and perhaps more of a threshold, 20% of the Senate, which makes it more difficult to gum up the works. The House bill, which was championed by members of that January 6th committee, saw for it to be 33%, but the Senate, as is often the case in these disputes, prevailed on this one. But here it is, signed into law imminently, nearly 2 years after the Capitol riot. It's something that got done, but it may be the biggest legislative effect from January 6th.
And Mario, before we turn to Zelensky's visit, I have to pause and say that the House Ways and Means Committee, apart from January 6th, they got something done too. They are releasing the former president's tax returns, President Trump's. The New York Times says that the tax returns show that former President Trump paid $1.1 million during his presidency, but $0, that's right, $0 in 2020. We covered Trump together. What's your big takeaway from the tax returns finally getting released?
Well, he fought tooth and nail, if you remember, for a long time on this. He knew that it could be a damning subject. If you go back to his debate with Hillary Clinton years ago, he said that not paying taxes makes him smart. But at the same time, that juxtaposes against this patriotism and America First mantra that he takes up as well. It's been a bad 6 to 8 weeks for someone who's starting their 2024 presidential bid. And the news just keeps getting worse and worse for former President Donald Trump.
Yeah.